There are a few things cooler than giant war machines fighting in a futuristic city. For well over a century, mankind has been fascinated with giant robots duking it out on a titanic scale. Hundreds of franchises feature mechs, and it's a really fun avenue I haven't explored much on this channel. So in this video, I'm building a miniature city battlefield for battling mechs at 6mm scale. I'll build a game board, come up with some innovative techniques, and show you an efficient way to get playing. In the miniature world, the far and away heavyweight of mech battle games is BattleTech, a franchise that's been around since the mid-1980s, spawning a huge extended universe and legions of enthusiastic fans. BattleTech has been tickling at the corners of my interest for a while now, but it has a reputation for being a tremendously complex rule set, and as someone who's a hobbyist first and gamer second, that's held me back from plunging into the world of mechs. So when I learned about a new game that features a very simple rule set, a small playing battlefield, and simple elegant rules that can be learned and played in less than 30 minutes, I was immediately interested. That game is Flames of Orion. Flames of Orion is currently running a Kickstarter, by the way, and I'm not sponsored or affiliated with them in any way, except for the fact that I know the creator Steve. Fought on a 2x2 table, Flames is easy to play on the go. I've played in airports and hotels using salt shakers as terrain, but I wanted to make a compact and cool table to play some games on. I came up with the idea of having 4 1-foot by 1-foot tiles that can rotate in any direction to make a variety of different layouts. I mocked up the idea onto some little pieces of chipboard. I thought it would be cool to have a sort of dystopian city with a filthy polluted river running through it. Look how cool this is. You rotate the pieces, but they always still line up. Hell yeah. Once I was satisfied with my layout, I started building the tiles for real, using 1-inch insulation foam to make the raised areas that will form the banks of the rivers. Using some construction adhesive to hold down the foam, it's a simple matter of recreating the layouts I made on the little tiles. As you can see, I have some ramp areas leading to the riverbed as well. With everything glued down, you can see there are still some gaps in the foam. So using some pre-mixed spackle filler, I start filling all those in. Where there's an extra large gap, I use a bit of paper just to fill some of the space before adding the spackle. Now that everything's dry, I mark the edge of my tiles with a pencil, then draw in the rivers that will be down in this riverbed area. These marks ensure that the river will exit each tile in a uniform width, making sure they all line up nicely. With those guidelines down, I use a heavy wood glue to glue some sand and gravel down, making the banks of the river. This will provide just a small amount of relief and some texture, which should look right at the scale that I'm going for. Once everything is dry, I coat the whole piece with a mix of black paint and varnish. This will help seal everything in, providing a little bit of durability. I make sure to paint the edges of each tile too. Once that's done, I mix in some off-white into the paint mix, creating a nice dark gray, and I paint all the raised areas with that gray. That's going to create a nice concrete look. The color is still very flat though, so once everything's covered, I add some more off-white to create an even lighter gray, and then add some of that in splotches. With a damp sponge, I stipple that lighter color around, creating a nice variation in tone that makes everything look a little bit better. So I've painted a few mechs, including these cool official Flames of Orion mechs sculpted by Anna Polanchuk from Gardens of Hecate. On those I used a basing scheme that I learned from my friend Thomas Koltow that's since become one of my favorites. Over a black undercoat, I thinned down some of the Army Painter's dark rust and fresh rust paints, maybe like 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and then thinly apply it over the sand. When this dries, it makes a cool red rusty wasteland effect. It doesn't use too much paint, it doesn't take too much effort, and it looks pretty awesome when it's dry. So, in order to make the battlefield match the bases of my mechs, I'm going to be using this same technique for the banks of the river down in the lower areas of the board. Over the black undercoat, I apply that thinned on rust paint, and when it dries, you get this great wastelandy look. I especially like that it has this sort of Edward Bertinsky-esque polluted look. When that's done, I come back in with some black paint to clean up the edges of the river and make sure that it's totally black in the center. To get a more wet look, I paint the river with some gloss varnish as well. This has the added effect of making the black appear extra dark, bringing in some nice contrast. Alright, with the base of my table looking pretty good, I can turn my attention to making some buildings. First, I'm going to cut a piece of foam into roughly the size and shape of a nice high-rise. Next, I'm going to cut it about 20% of the way up, making 2 pieces. With a hot wire foam cutter, I'm going to shave the longer piece on each side, making it slightly smaller in length and width than the other piece. Setting my hot wire cutter to about 2 mm in thickness, I cut the shorter piece into thin slices. Then I cut the longer piece into slices about 8 mm thick. Using some construction adhesive, I now glue these pieces together in a sandwich, alternating thick and thin. The thinner pieces stick out a little bit, creating the delineation between different stories. And just like that, I have a basic shape that looks a lot like a high-rise building. Now, because this method of construction produces something that's very lightweight, it helps to add some other bits for stability and weight. I glued together 2 wooden cubes I had lying around, cladding them in some cereal box card, then trimmed one of my foam high-rise towers and glued it on there. A few squares of card and other greebles will add some nice detail as well. And just like that, I have some pretty decent looking 6mm high-rise buildings. There is a ton of potential to this method and all sorts of other ways to detail these things that could be really great. Now, you could easily build a whole city this way, but if you have limited hobby time, as most of us do, you might want to look into 3D printing. Bamboo Labs sent me their A1 printer to test out, and I'm seriously impressed. This thing feels very advanced. Setup was pretty easy. It wasn't in too many pieces to begin with, and the screws and screw holes at each step were all really clearly labeled. I got the AMS light attachment, which holds 4 spools of filament at once, allowing for multicolor printing. It was the calibration though that really impressed me. In addition to being self-leveling, which is always nice, it had some really advanced features. Once you boot it up, it starts measuring the noises of its own motors, so it can make itself quieter with a noise-canceling algorithm. It also measures and adjusts to its own vibrations, so it can compensate for that as well for more accurate prints. Listen to it doing that right now, vibrating at higher and higher frequencies. It sounds like a supercar or something. That rules. But enough about the machine. The important thing is that it prints like a dream. There are lots of great files for 6mm terrain on sites like My Mini Factory and Cults 3D, and I bought a bunch of them. I particularly like the ones from Resonant Miniatures, but a real downtown is full of diverse architectural styles, so finding different designs is half the fun, to be honest. Some files were different scale, but using Bamboo Studio, which is the slicing software that this printer comes with, rescaling them is a breeze. Bamboo Studio seems to have lots of other cool features too. I'll have to dig into that in the future. The miniatures are printed in great quality, with barely noticeable layer lines. This must be an effect of all the calibrations it did. Overall, I'm really impressed with the print quality and the A1 combo in general. If you want to pick up one of your own, go to Bamboo Labs' website using the link in my description. Thanks Bamboo Labs for sponsoring this video. Alright guys, we got enough buildings printed now that I think it's time to put some primer on these bad boys. Some of them don't have the filler primer, some of them do, but I don't think the filler primer is making too much of a difference. The print quality is pretty good. So let's put some black on these bad boys. I've got an idea. Once dry, I used a bluish gray in a rattle can, hitting them mostly from above to give them a nice neutral gray color, but leaving some of the black shadows in the deepest recesses. I hit them with a rattle can of some off-white paint from directly above, catching the edges and creating a high contrast lighting effect that brings out a lot of the detail. I painted my scratch-built buildings in the exact same way, but before hitting them with the rattle cans, I applied a mix of Mod Podge and black paint to seal the foam and protect it from the spray can's accelerant a little bit. With just this preliminary step, we already have a really awesome effect. Alright, let's make these buildings look a little bit more like they're in a war zone. First, I'm going to add some bridges to some of the gaps over the rivers. Before printing these, I scaled them to the exact dimensions of where I wanted them in the slicer, just overlapping the banks a tiny bit. Then I cut down the excess amount so they slotted right into place. I initially glued them down, but I almost immediately regretted that, as I realized that it made my tiles no longer as neatly stackable, so I ripped them up. These parts will be as removable as the rest of the buildings. The first thing we're going to do is dry brush them with an off-white, just to pull out a little bit more detail and highlight some of the edges that weren't caught by the spray cans. To be honest, I didn't shake the spray paint well enough, and I got a pretty speckly effect as a result. So this will help to reduce that and camouflage that as well. Now these pieces are the background of the game, so we're going to keep the color scheme very simple and not worry too much about details. My goal right now is to get this table ready to play. I can always come back in later and punch up the fine details. On the buildings with pipes and other industrial details, I'm going to paint them a very dark brown to suggest a rusty, worn metal. I'll add a few nicks and dings as well with the same color. What I'm trying to do is have a very desaturated, simple palette. This is going to imply a dusty, post-apocalyptic war zone, and the simpler you keep a color scheme of your terrain, the more it's going to make your miniatures pop against it. I'm also going to use a square-tipped brush to add some darkness to some of the windows. This is going to look like missing windows or windows without the shades drawn, and it'll add a lot to the look of the whole city when you see it at a glance. Even though none of the buildings are explicitly ruined, if there were fighting going on in these buildings, stray rounds would punch into these windows and knock some of them out and give it this sort of semi-ruined look that I'm going for. To weather all these buildings, I tried something new. I took some homemade black wash and I put it in a spritzer bottle, then generously spritzed it onto all of the buildings. This dark wash will seep into the cracks, adding some extra contrast and highlighting the details a little bit. Doing it this way was probably messier and less efficient than just brushing it on, but it worked reasonably well. Okay, let's set up the tiles and place our buildings on there in a fun layout. Hell yeah. I think this looks pretty awesome, and in a fairly short period of time I was able to populate this whole board with buildings. I'm really pleased with the method I came up with for scratch building buildings, but it's nice to have the variation that the 3D printed buildings can add. The nice thing about 3D printing is it's not a replacement for scratch building, it's an addition. These buildings were printing while I was building the others, allowing me to just do more and get ready for games faster. I'm excited to play Flames of Orion on this table, and if you're interested in the game system, check out the Kickstarter. It ends in just a few days. A huge thank you to all of my Patreon patrons for their continued support, and thanks to Bamboo Labs for sponsoring this video and sending me the A1. Thanks for tuning in everyone, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.